Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the new Mega Evolution format. There are actually 7 regional or special championships in this format and 1 international, so definitely worth getting a grip on this new metagame and taking a look at the changes of the brand new expansion. We're going to be looking at the sort of old favourites from the black and white format, as well as looking at the online data for the Mega Evolution online meta share. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the previous best performers in our last format. That's just in the Masters Division, by the way. And then we have the overall online meta share for Mega Evolution to see what's being played and what's popular. Interestingly, when you combine the archetypes, the only 3 decks that are above 10% in play rates right now are Gardevoir builds, Dragapult builds, and Golden Go builds. So there does seem to be a lot of variety being played on the ladder. Of course, there's always this new exuberance and excitement trying out the new archetypes coming into a format, even if they're not all that powerful. Looking at things like the Mega Lucario, the Garchomp, obviously gains new fighting tools. Also standouts are Alakazam, which has seen top 10 of popularity for a single prize sort of rogue archetype, hand expansive archetype. It's quite an interesting approach to have, as well as the Mega Venusaur also making it that top 10 of play rate that is right now. So people are definitely trying out the new shiny toys that go into not only the old decks, but also brand new ones sprouting out from this expansion, just to get a good picture of what is popular right now. This is a really good standout if you wanted to take a look. But also, I've gone through the data myself, and I've attributed various points to the size of the online tournaments going on right now. So if you want the very quick snapshot, here it is. In the first couple of weeks of the online tournaments, Grimmsnarl's come out the best, followed by Gardevoir, then Dragapult, mostly very, very heavily. The Dragadusk getting the huge chunk of those points. Then there's the Golden Go, and that's largely trolley builds with Luna Rock now in there as well. Charizard, of course, finally benefiting by having Psyduck, so you can protect yourself against the Dragapult Dusknoir player a little bit. Ceruledge also benefiting from the rocks coming into the deck. Pidgeot Control has had a really good couple of weeks in the online standings. This also gains some interesting new toys from the expansion as well. And then we have that B tier starting to really bloat out the amount of decks here. Zoroark still doing fine. Crustal's having a nice resurgence with some cool toys as well. There's that Alakazam that does sort of like fit into our top 10 if we were strictly going just off of these points. But I believe it's going to have an inflated player online just because it's a fun, easy deck to pick up and people want to see the gimmick for themselves. But we'll look at the data in a moment, and I think it will put people off for major tournaments to take this. Terrabox, Garchomp, and then we have Cash in Hand as well as Raging Bolt rounding out our B tier. And the C tier are decks that you might come across at a tournament, but very rarely going to hit more than one of those as well. And they have picked up some points, but not a vast amount compared to the other top decks in the game. Before we get into the top 10, I just want to talk about some honourable mentions then, and really just highlight the reasons why I think they're being held back from the top 10 list right now. Not just the raw points they've accumulated in some cases, but also just like what the metagame data is looking at. And it's obvious that Lucario has a pretty poor time into the Gardevoir. Everyone could expect that thanks to the ×2 weakness and being a 3-prize Pokemon and having no easy way to get through the resistance sometimes of Gardevoir, forcing you to have these big combo turns. But equally, it seems poor into Grimmsnarl and poor into Golden Go as some of the high-profile awkward matchups for this deck. So even with attempts like playing a Zoro Lucario, I think you don't really solve all of those issues. I still think you're vulnerable into Golden Go. I still think you're weak into Grimmsnarl. So I think there's not really an easy package out the box to make Lucario work. And that's a lot of sacrifice matchups, which makes me a little bit nervous. Looking at Alakazam, it's really good at just beating through the other aggro decks in the game. Ceruledge, Golden Go, Raging Bolt, even Terrabox, like all of these decks that love to find uptrade situations and use multi-prizes, Alakazam laughs through them because guess what? These decks play like 1 or 0 hand disruptors, so suddenly Alakazam is like getting ridiculous damage output and being a 1-prizer and has the likes of like the Shaman to block easy multi-prize turns from Terrabox and whatnot. So it's obvious to see the good matchups are there on paper, but you're not just going to hit the aggro decks in a format. You're also going to come up against the decks that play 3 to 4 copies of Iono, and that's going to be Gardevoir, Grimmsnarl, and Dragapult. And these have been, top 5 performers, if not the top two, for Gardevoir and Dragapult in that tug of war for the best deck in format for a number of formats now. So I think Alakazam definitely more a fun niche pick, not actually that serious if you're going to be taking it to a tournament, just on the data that I'm looking at right now. And then Mega Venusaur, I still think it's having that sort of identity period where it's figuring out the best way to build it. I've built it pretty substantially differently to other builds on the channel so far. We've done a very defensive, like, control-y build, but oftentimes I'm seeing it as like a tempo deck alongside Ogerpon. I think it has a huge chunk of issues going for that approach. As you can see, where the build revolving around the Ogerpon is much more weak to the Raging Bolt, the Terra Box, the likes of Ceruledge and Charizard, the decks that can take these easy up trades. But then it's also got a kind of weak time into Dragapult and Grimmsnarl as well. So you'd think the Grimmsnarl matchup would be good for Venusaur, just being a big grass guy with lots of healing, but still somehow it finds a way to have a tough time. So yeah, I think Venusaur still figuring out the best build for it is going to be the first hurdle, where maybe I think this has the potential that perhaps Lucario and Alakazam don't, to be better in future, but it's still being the best build figured out. But not only is, in Venusaur's case, the matchups not great into some high-profile stuff, but there's no real core selling point here. The only good matchup is like a Golden Go Joltik or like a Lucario. So it's like there's really not much reason to be playing Mega Venusaur in the format right now. But let's get into our top 10 then. And you're going to see I've once again used Trainer Hill data for the traffic lighting here. So this is the online tournament results for this archetype, just to give you a good idea of these matchups. And it seems like the most awkward matchups for Raging Bolt, and the reason why I feel like it's sinking towards the bottom of our top 10 is because Ceruledge is another new archetype on the block that can be an aggressor, has O-Hit-KO potential, but Ceruledge just can manipulate prizes that little bit better. So I think with the Lunar package coming into Ceruledge to make it more consistent, and the fact that, you know, it's a Terra EX, so it can use Briar and has Legacy, I think it just has more cheats and tricks than Raging Bolt, which is a real issue for aggro decks in the format. It's very rare that we can have too many aggro decks being viable in the game, because if, for example, Raging Bolt is bad into Ceruledge, in this case, it then suddenly becomes like an even worse pick of an aggro choice, because you should just be playing the other aggro deck. So seeing Raging Bolt weak to Ceruledge, but also fairly weak to Terra Box, two big issues there, I think, for the archetype. Also struggling into both builds of Gardevoir, the Jellicent seeming a little bit more awkward, because there's also Item Lock in the mix there. Also not great into the Golden Go decks. The biggest selling point is that it has a time into Crustle. It can really bully Zoroark, which is trying to be a tanky deck, but Raging Bolt can push through that, and even has weakness from Ogerpon if it needs it. Same thing can be said for the Grimmsnarl matchup, and then it's okay into Dragapult and into Charizard as well. But I think it's a tough ask for Raging Bolt. The format's just getting worse for it. There's a new aggro deck in Ceruledge that we'll have a look later. It's higher in the list now. It's a much better deck, I think. And when you're the aggro deck weak in an aggro mirror, it starts to become a more awkward choice. Similar to how Raging Bolt kept out Joltik Box for a long period of time. It feels like Raging Bolt is slipping down that tier list. Taking a look at the list, there's not too much different, to be honest with you. It's stuff that we've seen before from the deck. It's still very good at what it does, you know. It still gets into the game very efficiently, still has Judge Disruption, which I think is a big selling point, still has a lot going for it, but ultimately the matchup spread is getting just far less appealing for Raging Bolt in the field. Let's have a look at number 9 then, and I've got Crustle. The matchup data is terrifying for this deck. It does have some very polarized, very likely wins that as soon as you set up a caped Crustle, your opponent's in a lot of trouble. And also you'll note when we look at my 60, I've tried to accommodate for Gardevoir. These are the unfavorable matchups where they have lots of recycle for lots of single prize attacking Pokemon that can get through the Crustle, being the core bad matchup. Also Pidgeot Control being awkward. Also Raging Bolt being awkward with lots of single prize options their own end. I feel like at the very least, with the package I've tried to incorporate, you can give yourself a chance into Bolt and into Gardevoir. Although I think Gardevoir's winnable, I think Raging Bolt is still a bit of a dodge matchup, to be honest. Everything else seems like pretty okay for the Crustle, and the ability is so annoying. And as we get to the package of cards we've tried to add in, this is shout out to both Cal Connor as well as Justin, who have come up with this list. Where you have the Ethan Sudowoodo package in here with both Mist and Therapeutic Energy in the deck, so you can try and impound trap Monkey Dories from Guardy players, and then you can heal loop with your own Adrenabrain and Ferment Juice from Shuckle. With Defiance Vest, you can make sure that there's no extra damage coming into play from the opponent, and you're just going to trap this Monkey Dory infinitely, where you take 20 damage and then heal off with Shuckle. And with the Zoroark's Machinations in the list, you should be the one with more cards in your deck by the end of the game if you just time the Zerosic correctly. So I actually think Crustle is a big concern. It got better into Drag at Dusk as well, which is like the other big thing to bear in mind here, is that with the Psyduck, you can try and protect yourself from Curse Blast shenanigans. Now, they can still attack with the Dusk package, but it's just far less dangerous for you than it was previously. So timing the Psyduck correctly is also like a big deal. And it does seem like this deck is getting very, very tricky to play against for a huge portion of our metagame. Getting into number 8, we have Terrorbox. This had a bit of a resurgence as of late. Doesn't really gain a huge amount from the new expansion, but still has a lot of those same boasts where it's still fairly solid into Gardevoir and Drag at Dusk. It's also very decent into Golden Go and Raging Bolt. It's even into the new Ceruledge. It can take on Crustle by just having early aggression and having some single prize options in the deck. And to be fair, the weakest matchups aren't the most popular in the field. Like I said, I think Alakazam is more of a gimmick archetype for fun. I think Golden Go, the cash in hand build, is far less popular than the straight build. So I think you can very often see the good matchup rather than the bad one. And then Charizard seems to be the highest profile, very poor matchup, with Pidgeot Control and Enzoroc also being in that equation. Taking a look at my list, I think a big change from Terrorbox is that you really should be playing the Vitality Band. I think that becomes more and more core in the deck because it can help you out against Gardevoir, either giving you a Pikachu KO into Gardevoir with E-Switch Crispin shenanigans with Teal Mask, or it gives you a way to torrential pump through an active position Monkey Dory. And the reason why I think this is actually more important now is that it also lets you torrential pump through active position Solrock or Lunatone in some other new matchups like Golden Go and up against Ceruledge as well. Yes, of course, you still have Hyperblower from Iron Bundle, but this Vitality Band gives you that extra dimension to make sure you get the 2 prize pumps going. And to try and support this, we have the 2 count of the Teal Mask Ogerpon in the deck list, as well as those 2 E-Switch as well. So I think, well, in this build, I'm not playing the Terrapagos. I'm just going double teal instead and saying that that can help support the Vitality Band, which we know is very good on both Pika and on Wellspring. And every now and then it can come into play into other Pokemon, of course, as well, because we have so much flexible damage potential in the deck. But ultimately, this gives you all sorts of avenues to get creative and take additional knockouts. So I think it's oftentimes only a usable card when you have like decent hands and have the option to, for example, double Noctowl. But in those situations, you're still running away with the games and the opponent can't really play around it. And that's still one of the main benefits of this approach. Going into number 7, then we have Enzoroc. Again, this has a really high-profile win under its belt and is still benefiting from the new expansion coming out. Again, Psyduck being a nice inclusion to helps out the Drag at Dusk matchup, which I think was already pretty okay with the Toedscruel, but I think it's more secure now with Psyduck than it was. It's still being held by the good Gardevoir matchup being one of the best reasons to play the archetype, and also seems to be okay into the Golden Go. Whether you're playing Cornerstone or Toedscruel, those are still decent choices. The weak matchups, Ceruledge, a new one on the block that's very, very tough for you to deal with. You don't really have many answers to Crustle. There's the Grimmsnarl, which is also awkward just because you have so many abilities that naturally come into play. It gives them so many counters to play with and have Devo plays. The Pidgeot Control is really rough, and the Raging Bolt remains a pretty poor matchup. The build I've taken really is inspired by Liam's winning list, but I have gone for the full 4 count of Lily's Determination. I think it's just far too good of an early game turn 1 and 2 supporter to ignore, so I have trimmed into the Hilda and Cyrano counts and said that Lily is just completely broken. We have to go for this. And you'll also note that I've, with the Psyduck inclusion, taken out the Toedscruel. I've decided that Cornerstone plus Psyduck plus Fighting Energy is like a less invasive, easier way to get into games. That gives you more avenues into those matchups. So I think the Cornerstone is trying to give you some semblance of a time into the Cornerstone for Golden Go and Psyduck for the Dusknoir package that can be in both Charizard and, of course, Dragapult builds that can give us a bit of a helping hand. I think there's also an argument to have the new Yveltal in the deck. I still like the Maractus. I think the amount of Pokemon that resist grass is beneficial. It's another way that you can sort of trapdoor the Golden Go matchup at times if they are spending their Tauros on whatnot. So I feel like the Maractus is still better in that case. And I also think Exploding Needles can set up Math View as well. I still like the Watchtowers. I think there's still going to be enough just about Terrorbox, as well as potential Flareon, which we haven't talked about, as well as Raging Bolt. So I'm still on the Watchtowers. I think that could also potentially be space if you can pinpoint the metagame and expect less owls. But right now I'm still trying to have that catch-all approach that Liam went for his win. In at number 6, we have Charizard. Again, decent Gardevoir matchup. I think the unfavorable Dragger Dusk is at least getting closer with Psyduck. I think that's the only thing really making me think Charizard's that little bit better. We know it's okay into Golden Go. Interestingly, it's unfavorable here, but it's okay into the build with Iron Hands. But I do think that's also like fine for the deck. You're solid into the Raging Bolt, you're solid into Grimmsnarl. The Terra Box is a decent matchup. Your worst times come into Crustle and that Pidgeot control, as well as that Ceruledge, which is also a little bit awkward. But again, we have prize manipulation with the Dustoir coming into the deck. You have that maximum belt coming in. And yes, opponents can use Psyduck against you, but I think it's a bigger win that you gain Psyduck within your list. And I've tried to make it a streamlined build as well. Again, another huge beneficiary of Lily, because we're one of the biggest setup decks in the room, no doubt. You can still think about having Mist in the deck. You can still think about a few other counts here. This is like one of my builds, but I feel like this is a decent starting point for any Charizard player out there. Going on to number 5 then, this is going to be combined Golden Go. So I'm starting off with the list with Iron Hands just to get us going, but I'm going to be talking about straight Golden Go as well and have a list for both. So the initial list here with the Iron Hands, it feels like the weakest matchups are Charizard, Crustle, Pidgeot Control, and Alakazam. You seem to be pretty solid into Gardevoir. You're safe into the Mirror, safe into Ceruledge and Raging Bolt. So into all the other aggro multi-prize builds, you're like at least balanced and okay into the Terra, or pretty good into the Terra Box as well. And then you're solid into Dragger Dusk and Guardy. So the potential here is actually pretty high. For how low of a play rate this deck gets, I think it's got a bit of a bad rap, because I actually think the deck still has a lot of potential and can go far in tournaments. My build is currently playing the Galvantula in the deck to try and give yourself an attacking option into Crustle and being that grass typing, which we know is good with Grimmsnarl and Charizard, both sort of on the incline, in addition to that Zoroark as well, especially because if there are still going to be builds of Toedscool, it's nice to have the Galvantula as an attacking threat in those instances, although I would expect most Zoroark to be off the extra stage 1 grass type, so that Galvantula could potentially be a spot. Right now, I'm only on 3 Superior. That's definitely my sort of cheekiest count going on in the deck, but I often find myself really leading out early with Bravery Charmed Iron Hands. In so many situations, that's taking 2 or 4 prize cards, so it's very rare that you need all 3 Superior in the game, especially with the Levincia in the list as well. So I feel like it's a risk I'm happy enough to take in this case. And yeah, I still feel like this archetype has a lot of potential in the game. The other build of Golden Go now incorporates Lunatone Solrock. The vast majority of the top placements have been with this new build, incorporating the Precious Trolley just like we saw out in Japan. My playtesting didn't really love this approach, and actually I was trying a build that still had ESP, even in a Lunarok build, but I have to go with the data in this case and just accept that there's a lot of win percentage from these new waves of the Lunarok package, giving yourself that single prize approach, giving yourself that push potential, just extra draw on top of all your coin bonuses and whatnot. The matchup data is really weird for this build, though. It doesn't actually look that good, so I'm kind of on fraud alert for the trolley build of Golden Go. Like I said, it's had the most results, but also I think people are bandwagoning from the Japanese data, and I do implore you to still attempt a build that still has Lunarok in it, but with an ESP as well. I'm going to be showing you a trolley build, but I'm just letting you know that my own personal testing didn't go great with this build, and I still prefer ESP, even with Lunarok as a more small package that just come in as a single prize attacker, similar to how we saw the Make It Rich, or sorry, yeah, what is it, Make It Rich? Strike It Rich Golden Go, that comes in just to help deal with single prize cards, because there's a lot of unfavorables here. Ceruledge is a new issue for Golden Go. That's why I think it's slipping a little bit down the tier list just generally, is that there's a new aggro deck in the format that feasts on Golden Go. You're also weak into Crustle. You're weak into Zoroark based on their tech, whether it's Cornerstone or whether it's the Toedscool. Both can be problematic. Pidgeot's problematic. Terra Box and Alakazam, all issues. But then where's the good matchups? You know, everything else is just okay. And the fact that more people are moving towards a jelly build of Gardevoir is a big issue for you when you much prefer facing the straight build. So, yeah, I feel like this build is definitely on my fraud alert. But nonetheless, this is the build that's been really doing the rounds, again, based on the Japanese tournament data. Like I said, I still like ESP as a choice. I feel like we have no issue getting our Golden Go into play just from Poffin and Quad Nest. I think the Genesect really opens itself up for that approach. But nonetheless, this is the one that's doing the best. I'm still holding my hands up and saying I'm unconvinced by this build, but the data doesn't really lie here. Into number 4, and really jumping up that tier list, we have Ceruledge. I think this deck is really real, to be honest. I think it's a very, very strong aggro presence that can close the game in just 3 attacks pretty consistently. The rocks really help out here, getting you that crucial single prize KO, and that sets you up for a Briar play. Or in some cases, you can take multiple prizes with the rocks as your opponent sort of scrambles around, doesn't have much to do. And even if that doesn't get you going into the game, you have that legacy energy as well, which is going to make your opponent play completely differently. The unfavorables for Ceruledge are the Crustle, the Pidgeot control, and the Alakazam. Then we also have a slight unfavorable into the straight Gardevoir, although it's okay into Jelly Guardy, so I feel like it sort of comes out even for the most part anyway. Terrabox is slightly unfavored. You're average into Dragadusk. You're okay into the Hands build of Golden Go, but solid into the regular builds. Grimmsnarl's even, and then you're also okay into Zard, Zorro, and Raging Bolt. So for my money, it's the best aggressive deck that we actually have in the game right now. I think it actually surpasses the Golden Go. Even though I do think it's slightly less consistent, I think its matchup data is just like way too solid, and I think its logic is also pretty sound. So I think, yes, it's got inflated play rate, but I think for good reason. With both Briar and Legacy in the deck, with so few cards remaining towards the end game, you're going to find a way to make that happen and give yourself that win con with so much draw from Fez with Lunar Cycle, the Night Stretchers, the one Poké Gear. Even in the deck, it sounds like a joke, but that actually gives you enough reach to find that Briar in the late game, and oftentimes that's just going to be all she wrote. Into number 3, then I think our top 3 are all sort of stage 2 defensive decks. And it feels like Dusknoir is still pulling away. It's really strange in that Psyducks come out, but there's still just a huge amount of players just going towards the Dusknoir build saying this is just by far the best. Its matchup data, again, isn't that astonishing. It still has the weak Gardevoir. It doesn't enjoy Crustle or Pidgeot. It's only average into Golden Go. The Grimmsnarl's not great, Zorro's not great, and Terrabox isn't great. In this case, I'm just going with my gut that this archetype has been so strong over the last, I don't even know how many months, and that even with the matchup data looking this poor online, I have to feel like the strong pilots of Dragondust are still going to go far in the tournament. So I really think that of this, the Gardevoir is still the biggest concern, and everything else you can kind of work out as you go. Now, that said, there is the big caveat that Psyduck is a big issue, and that it will make your time more difficult when you feel like you're sewing up a game. Suddenly you have to adapt. That said, I'm going for an approach that does incorporate 3 copies of Rare Candy. I'm not full 4 like Tord had, but I think making the space for 3 does give you some explosiveness with the Dusknoir and the Dragapult. It means that finding that Hilda becomes an instant, like, crazy high roll. But I do think Jamming Tower is still just pretty solid. There's Crustle in the metagame, so I want to have that stadium card. Maybe even 2 count would be worthwhile, to be honest with you, just because of how relevant it is to shut down certain tools. It's also okay into Gardevoir as well, of course. So I'm with a fairly straightforward build. Lily's a huge upgrade to research, and it does still make the deck just far better in a vacuum, in my opinion. And it means you get to hold on to those candies for the whole game, which is just pretty insane to make sure that even in the late game with Stretcher, you can have big pop-offs. In at number 2, then, coming back in a big way, is Grimmsnarl. And what's really interesting about Grimmsnarl is that it kind of went away at Worlds because of that huge wave of Golden Go that came into the mix. Now, suddenly, with a slight change in the build, Golden Go no longer having ESP, Grimmsnarl's actually pretty tanky. A turn 2 Grimmsnarl is difficult to be dealt with by a Rocks build of Golden Go, whereas an ESP build will just like start sneezing through it and find easy O-hit kills throughout the entire game, and then its big issue is like, does it have Picnic Basket, Monkey, and Turo? Now, they can't deal with Grimmsnarl very easily at all, so suddenly that matchup's become a lot better. And the other good news is that Ceruledge is in the game now, pushing down the percentage of Golden Go in the field, giving them something to worry about, and that matchup's also pretty even for you as well. So Grimmsnarl really welcomes the introduction of Ceruledge to the metagame. We know that Grimmsnarl's pretty solid into Dragadusk and Gardevoir already. It also seems okay into Zoroark, making it a pretty appealing choice. One of the few decks that has a very good time into Pidgeot control as well, it must be said. So it looks like Grimmsnarl's looking really good, especially when Raging Bolt is its weakest matchup. And it's looking like the rest of the data for Raging Bolt is pretty poor on the whole. So I think Grimmsnarl's in a phenomenal spot, and it also gains Lily. And this is the like most high-profile engine-less deck. It doesn't even play Fez, it doesn't even play Mew EX, so it's all in on what supporters it draws throughout the entire game, meaning that when you gain a quality upgrade in the likes of Lily over Research, boy, this is such a big deal. I don't know why, by the way, the Morgrim's out of position. That's just how it's been pasted from PTGL. I tried to change it and it just wasn't having it. But yeah, I do think this deck is really, really strong right now, and you don't have to get too crazy with the list. We already have a really good baseline to go off of, and I think Grimmsnarl is looking like it's a really strong choice going into the next few weeks. In at number one, though, it has to be Gardevoir. Even though it's not the best performer on the online data, and even though it has this ridiculous handful of weak matchups, again, you just have to look at the IRL tournament results of Gardevoir, where it's been so dominant for so many months. And let's not forget how many upgrades Gardevoir gains from this set as well. You get to improve your Rolts and Curlier. There's potential for the Mega. There's Mystery Garden as well, which is just a crazy stadium card. So I think we just have to say that Gardevoir continues to be the best deck. Now, I do have to give the caveat that Zoroark could be out in force, Zard could be out in force, Grimmsnarl could be out in force. People are bored of losing to Gardevoir, and these decks definitely will pop up. Also, it's worth noting that the Jelly build has a much better time in the mirror, thanks to its Devo approach and its potential to have item lock as well. So I'm going to be showing both a Jelly build and a straight build of Gardevoir. This data is just for the straight build right now, that's just no Jelly whatsoever. And its data is looking just less appealing on the whole. So quickly going to go over this, mostly just so I can talk about the engine rework, where we could easily see an Arvenless Gardevoir these days that has just the good draw supporters in the game, plus triple Candy and Box, trying to be essentially 4 copies to find your turn 2 Candy Guardy. And then we have some Mystery Gardens in the deck to be additional discard of Psych Energy and additional draw power. Because I think with Fez, Mew, you're increased supporter draw power and 2 of this stadium now, Gardevoir once again becomes this deck that can just draw an unholy amount of cards. So a few other tweaks here. I do have the 1 Poffin just as a potential to box into it turn 1, so you can go box for Garden Poffin rather than going like Artisan Vessel or something, some combination like that. And you no longer have the Evos because you don't play the Arven, so you just have an increased candy count. But of course, you still play the double Curlier, so that under item lock, you can even attack with Curlier if need be to call sign out additional basics if you're just going to be hit with Budu, knowing that if they're going to break the lock to knock out the Curlier, then you have candies back online. So yeah, I think this is a great approach for a straight Guardy. Its data is looking less appealing than a Jelly build, though, because Devo is such a strong combination. That's why the data looks a lot more appealing for a Jelly build of Gardevoir. The online data is really backing up that this was a great choice at our previous major events, where now you have a decent time into Crustle, a much better time into Dragonidusk and Guardy, also good into the Raging Bolt still. And then some of those weaker matchups also get a little bit more close. Suddenly you're even enough into Grimmsnarl, then you have slight unfavors into Goldengo and Ceruledge. You still have the issue into Zard, into Zoroark as well, but you still have that option for Devo at the very least. And then you're also weak into Pidgeot Control, Terrabox, and the Iron Hands with Goldengo combination. I've not got too creative with this build. I am still playing the Arven in this build because I do think Evo is still important here. And I also think the Balloon is important to find. Just the access with Arven to Air Balloon to get an early Frillish, I think, is just about important enough. So I'm not actually playing the Garden in this approach, but you could also do the same thing I've just done with the straight Guardy and said, let's cut Arven, let's cut Evo altogether, and just go for the Garden approach and just go higher on the candy counts. The reason I don't like that is that I do think Devo is the main sell of Jellicent. You're oftentimes working towards that approach from the very early stages of the game, so I want to have the option to cherry pick tools as the game progresses, and I think that's worthwhile still having this mixture of supporters. But I do think Lily can work its way in. Yes, I could definitely see that count increasing as well. If you just want to have 1 token research as a box option to have a 3rd Lily, if you think you can get away with 3 INO and go 3rd Lily, I also think that's okay. That trade-off is still yet to be made, but I do believe this is the strongest deck in the format right now. Definitely has some teetering consistency, but I do think it just seems to have wiggle room into all sorts of avenues, and it can find just so many plays to get out of any spot. So I think Gardevoir is still on top, and that's not too surprising when Mega Evo gave it a lot of potential new cards. Already had some honourable mentions at the start, mostly talking about their issues, but I did also want to touch on some other honourable mentions. The matchup data for the Quad Kangaskhan, as well as the Ogerpon Meganium, so this is the Venusaur Lus builds of Ogerpon that just try and wild growth and get huge Myriad Leaf Showers. That data's currently in other, so it's not quite something we can look at very well in Trainer Hill or on Play Limitless. So I do think there's something around the Kangaskhan deck. Yes, it's gimmicky, of course, but I do think there's certainly something around this card. It definitely is a strong engine, can manipulate prizes very well, can take advantage of comeback mechanics just by virtue of exploding energy as well. So I definitely want to see the Kangaskhan deck in action, although it does seem to have a fairly narrow matchup spread and does have some issues. The Acerola isn't the like checkmate card that it necessarily looks like on paper in certain matchups. And then Ogerpon Meganium, I personally think it's just weaker than Venusaur, although I'm someone that thinks Venusaur is better as a defensive deck anyway, so I simply don't believe in a let's flood the board of Grass Energy tee deck. I just don't think that's good or like as good as like Ceruledge, which can cheat prizes in 2 different directions. So I think there are better aggro decks in the game. A quick nod to Dragazard. I think this definitely benefits from Lily in a similar way that Grimmsnarl does. And I also think Dragazard as a combination, especially when there's Psyducks in the metagame to sort of diffuse Dustoirs. The fact that this can be a good combination that's still decent into Gardevoir is reasonable. Now, the reason it's not on the top 10, the reason I didn't show up for list is that the list hasn't really changed bar adding in Lily, and it's not that played online, and its data isn't that powerful either. It sits like on its own somewhere in the low C tier, so I feel like, in the mid C tier. For me, it's a sort of wait and see how popular Psyduck is, but I definitely have my eye on Dragazard to make a small resurgence perhaps at some point in the metagame. Same thing for Garchomp as well. I think the main matchup holding it back, if I remember correctly, is Golden Go, and then everything else is like pretty okay. So I think Garchomp also has the potential to be in that mix as well. Definitely a solid archetype and does gain a lot. I still think it's weak against Ino in the late stages, but I do think it just has absurd stats. It has 1 hit potential, it has 400 hit points, for goodness sake. Like, this card just has dummy stats that should be a decent choice. And then the other deck that I talked about a lot in terms of like, oh, this deck has a good matchup or bad matchup against is Pidgeot Control. So despite having pretty good matchups on paper and also despite having decent results recently in the online scene, I do think that there's a number of Pidgeot Control players that always do this at the beginning of formats just to inflate the data for the deck and then very rarely pull the trigger on it at major tournaments. It's just like a harder deck to play in person with time constraints, and even with the upgrades that we've recently had, like Psyduck being a big one, obviously, I do think that there's a reason to look at Pidgeot and be fearful of the archetype, but also I'm by no means an authority on like what a good list looks like, the purpose of every reason that certain cards are included. So I feel like rather than just spewing nonsense of something I don't know that well, I'm just going to leave it to other voices in the community about Pidgeot. There are plenty out there. For now, though, that's all I have to say on Mega Evolution Top 10. I think there's a big shake-up. I do think Ceruledge is pretty real. I think Golden Go Rocks is on my potential fraud list, and I think an ESP build could still be the best. That's just my personal testing, though. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one again soon. Cheers.